Before we start talking about why we're selling Editas Medicine stock, it's probably useful to tell you why we purchased the stock in the first place. So Editas Medicine was the first CRISPR gene editing firm to have an IPO. That was back in 2016. They priced their shares around $16 a share, and it started trading around $17. Today it trades somewhere in the $11 to $12 range. So prior to that, it had actually exceeded $90 a share. So it's had a volatile ride. Now, it's worth mentioning the approach we took to investing in gene editing was that we had no idea which of the firms that were working on CRISPR technology would come out ahead. So we took a spray and pray approach. Editas was one of the firms we invested in alongside several others in hopes that one would be able to strike gold, if not more. So when we revisited that thesis, now that we have more information, we were led to believe that Editas is not a company that's worth holding. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, recently we published a video on 27 gene editing stocks that we corralled together. We vetted them all, and we came to the conclusion that these 5 companies were worth looking at in greater detail. So you can see the fourth on the list is Editas, and there are some others here as well that we'll be exploring. But let's talk about Editas. And I think when we look at these firms, we do so in the context of what they're working on. So the therapies that they hang their hats on. For Editas, this was taken from, I think, the 10Q or 10K. They say we depend heavily on the success of Edit 101 and Edit 301. Except for these two, all our product development programs are at preclinical or research. So I think the idea here would be that if they can't make their 2 lead therapies work, the rest is kind of not going to happen. So why would pharmaceutical companies or partners step in to support a company that failed at bringing their 2 lead therapies to market? So that's what we wanted to talk about today, were these 2 particular therapies, and we'll start with the first. So this clinical trial is referred to as Brilliance, and the compound there is Edit 101, and it addresses a inherited eye disease called Leber congenital amaurosis, or LCA, and that's caused by mutations in 18 different genes. That's pretty easy to understand. And the one gene that they're targeting is CEP290, and it's the cause of this disease in approximately 20 to 30% of all LCA patients. Cool. So what's the population of patients? Well, the National Institute of Health estimates there to be between 3,000 to 30,000 people with the disease. Well, if they can address on the most optimistic end of that range, 30%, then there are 10,000 patients using the most optimistic estimates that this therapy can address. So quite a small population. And Editas had remarked that doing the clinical trial was difficult because they had to find particular types of patients. And when you look at the results so far, so here's an article from Biopharma Dive that talks about, this was in September of last year. It says, after a long wait, Editas reveals first data for this particular treatment, and it refers to the trial's small size and short patient follow-up that limit the conclusions. Well, they had been working on this for several years, so people were eagerly awaiting the outcome. And you can pull up this document. It's from September of last year. It's the phase 1/2 single ascending dose. This is surprisingly accessible. So you can go through this document, and most of it makes sense just to the average layperson. It's not very complicated. So when we look at what they're doing, they're testing safety, that it doesn't hurt people, and efficacy, does it actually cure people? So those are the 2 things. But primary objective is safety. So what they do is they start out with a low dose. You can see these tiers. Then they move to a mid dose and then a high dose. And then as they're going along, they can see, all right, is it causing any bad side effects? And are the patients realizing a benefit? Well, this result was around 6 patients. That's a small number. 2 were given a low dose and 4 were given a mid dose. And then Apparently now you can see at the bottom, there's the two pediatric levels, pediatric mid-dose and high dose. They're going to be dosing those levels this year. Now, you can read through the study yourself and see the results. Safety doesn't seem to be an issue. In terms of efficacy, there's mixed results. One patient here talks about being able to navigate this course. This is kind of cool stuff. So on the left, you can see this baseline. They had this navigation course they need to go through at 500 lux. So that's how much light was in the room, and this person failed. And then month 6 after their treatment, they're able to go through this course at 63 lux, so a lot less light, and they pass. And at the bottom, you can see what the patient says. I can see lines more clearly. I've been able to find things on the floor. I'm also able to see doorways. So the patient is realizing benefits, but this is a single person. And this is such, if you've taken a statistics course or looked at any sort of distributions of populations and sampling, this is just a very small sample size. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Now, one problem that came up, and this is worth noting, so they were working with a company called Allergan, and Allergan was acquired in May 2020. Well, 1 month before those results that we just looked at were published, AbbVie, that's a big pharmaceutical company, I believe one of the top 5 by market cap, they purchased Allergan and they backed out of their deal with Editas a month before those results were released. That's not good when your major pharmaceutical partner that you've been working with backs out before you release the results of a study. That's not a good thing. And then when that same partner goes and joins with one of your competitors, Caribou, that's not good either. And you can see here, this was a statement from the CEO. They always try to make lemons out of lemonade, or lemonade out of lemon, sorry. And it was just, we're pleased to regain full operating control. No, you're not. So now they're going at it alone, which is a problem. They're quite a small firm now. They're under $1 billion market cap. I'm not sure how much cash they have. And we didn't start going down that path because we came across some other red flags that are really worth noting. We had no idea things were this bad. So we had heard some chatter about C-level turnover. Well, it's pretty bad. So their CEO, who had been with the company not too long after it was founded, this Katrine Bosley, had departed, and that was following previously announced exits of the company's chief medical and chief financial officers. This was back in 2019. And since then, almost all of Editas's executive team has been replaced. So the next CEO was Cynthia Collins. She departed in February 2021 after lasting 1.5 years. She handed the reins over to James Mullen. And Mr. Mullen then in June, so this month, handed the reins over to another CEO, Gilmore O'Neill, who's said to be looking for a new chief medical officer because the last chief medical officer, Lisa Michaels, was fired after 15 months on the job in February of this year. And that was the 4th chief medical officer the company has gone through. This is indicative of a company with systemic problems. And it's difficult to say what those can be, because when you've changed over your entire staff and there's still internal turmoil, that implies maybe there's a problem with the technology or people are disagreeing. It's really hard to say. But if we're making these observations from the outside and getting a sick stomach at thinking about how bad things must be inside this firm, think about how prospective employees, so when they're going to recruit a CMO, think about how that CMO looks at this situation and thinks to themselves, is that a place that I'm really going to have career progression in, or am I going to get canned, or am I going to deal with something that I don't want to deal with? And then think about pharmaceutical partners that are looking at Editas and thinking to themselves, well, the last pharma partner exited. They can't seem to keep C-level positions occupied for more than a couple years. Why would we want to get involved with that? So that's something that needs to be considered for Editas. It's a huge red flag. Now, moving on to that second compound, so we already talked about the first. The second compound that Editas is hanging their hat on is called Ruby. This is Edit 301. This great diagram here comes from CRISPR Therapeutics, and it looks at blood disorders caused by mutations in this particular gene. And you can see that you have sickle cell disease or this beta thalassemia. And here's the prevalence to the right of that, and it talks about the burden of patient care, people needing to get transfusions, etc. Well, Editas may be working on a therapy, and they plan to dose their first patient this year, but CRISPR Therapeutics, the firm that had come up with that cool visual, has been making way further progress than Editas. So this is from a November 2019 article by Biopharma Dive. They publish a lot of good articles, actually. And it says, 9 months after receiving an infusion of gene-edited stem cells from CRISPR Therapeutics, a patient is free from the blood transfusions necessary for those who live with a severe disease. So that was back in 2019, after 9 months of a patient having an infusion and they're essentially cured. We're talking about, coming up on 3 years later. Think about the progress that CRISPR has been making since then, multiple clinical trials. And you've got Editas that's going to dose their first patient. When you're that far behind, is that something we really want exposure to as investors? Probably not. And there's another thing that we need to consider, which is the opportunity costs of holding Editas. So these three gentlemen here are notable individuals in the world of gene editing. So David Liu on the left-hand side there pretty much invented this new method of CRISPR editing called base editing. And the gentleman in the middle there, he was a co-founder of Verve Therapeutics. And the gentleman on the right, Feng Zhang, has just done all kinds of stuff. But these three individuals were co-founders of Editas along with George Church. And his name should be a household name, frankly, in terms of the sort of people that society ought to admire, but we prefer to admire celebrities instead. Mr. Church is by all means, one of the most accomplished scientists you'll come across. And these four individuals founded Editas. Well, guess what? These three that you see here, they have since founded another firm called Beam Therapeutics, and they're taking base editing and commercializing it. And these below comments are from George Church. Now, he didn't found Beam Therapeutics with these gentlemen, but he made these comments and said, what often passes as genome editing would more appropriately be called genome vandalism, and that this new technology, which is described as using a pencil to erase letters as opposed to using scissors to cut out a word, this offers a huge step forward, and it's arguably the most clever CRISPR gadget to date. So a lot of people think that Beam Therapeutics may have finally found the most viable method of gene editing, and there's also another technique they're working on called prime editing, and that's something we'll look at in a future article. But just to conclude on Editas, that turnover probably represents some systemic problem that we don't want to have anything to deal with. Their therapies aren't making promising progress, and there's an opportunity cost to hold any stock. And as we're holding Editas, we could be holding a more promising gene editing stock. So while we took that initial spray and pray approach by just purchasing shares of the first three gene editing IPOs to take place, today we're taking a more calculated approach that we did earlier with our video on 27 gene stocks, and now we're down to 5, one we covered today, and then we're left with 4. So we'll look to publish more videos on the topic of gene editing. Please put your comments in the comment section. Make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video today.